I'm Mrs. Neill, and this is lesson number 11, Basic Triangles. Today we're going to talk about triangle sum. Then we're going to talk about triangles classified according to their sides. We've got equilateral, isosceles, and scalene. And we're going to look at classifying triangles according to their angles. Equiangular, acute, right, obtuse. So let's start out with triangle sum. The sum of the measures of the angles of a triangle is 180 degrees. So all the angles of a triangle always add up to 180 degrees. No more, no less. So let's look at this example right here. I've got this triangle. All these angles in this triangle add up to 180 degrees. So if I've got angle 1, and I've got plus 35 degrees, plus 65 degrees, and that's equal to 180. So what if I need to know what angle 1 is? Well, just take 180 degrees and subtract 35 degrees and subtract 60 degrees. And angle 1 is going to be 80 degrees. All right, let's look at this example right over here. I've got this big triangle right here on the left, and two of its angles are 82 and 41. All right, so x plus 82 plus 41 is 180. I need to find out the measure of angle x. So take your 180, subtract the 82 and the 41, and you end up with 57 degrees. Now, look right here. Those two angles are what kind of angles? These two are vertical angles. Remember that from our earlier lesson? And vertical angles are congruent. So as a result, y and x are congruent to each other. So angle x is 57 degrees also. You're going to be using this bit of information all year long. The very last day of geometry class, when you're taking your final, you're still going to be using this theorem about the measures of the angles of a triangle is 180 degrees. Well, let's go on and look at our angles according to sides. The first one we're going to look at is equilateral. Equilateral, all sides of an equilateral triangle are congruent. They're exactly the same measure. Think of lateral meaning side, so they're going to be equal sides. And one way we distinguish that is if we have a triangle, what you'll see are a tick mark. When you see the one tick mark, that means that all these sides are congruent. You don't necessarily have to know the length of the side as a numerical value. If you just know, according to those tick marks, they're all going to be congruent, and that's equilateral. One thing about an equilateral triangle, if all the sides are congruent, all the angles are going to be congruent. And that brings us to equiangular, and we'll get to that in just a minute. We'll talk about that again. The next triangle is isosceles, and I bet you've heard of that before. If at least two sides of a triangle are congruent, you always call it isosceles. And we work with isosceles triangles a lot in geometry class. We'll have a whole section just on isosceles triangles in a few days. So that means that two sides are congruent. So you see the two tick marks? That means these two sides are congruent. Another property I'm going to go ahead and tell you about an isosceles triangle, the opposite angles are congruent. So if this side and this side is congruent, go opposite. That angle, go opposite. Those two angles are congruent to each other also. So if you have congruent sides, you are going to have some congruent angles in your triangles. All right, the last one. We had three sides congruent, two sides congruent. Now we're going to have no congruent sides. And that triangle is called scalene. When you think of scalene, think of the word scattered. You've got all different kinds of sides. They're all different lengths. So for example, I may have a triangle where, let's say this side is 3, and that side is 4, and that side is 5. That is a scaling because no sides are congruent. If you notice, I didn't put any tick marks on there to distinguish any congruency. When you have 3 different sides, what do you think about the angles? You're going to have 3 different measures of angles. This angle over here, for example, might be 90 degrees. And for example, this angle over here could be, let's say, 70 degrees. And this angle over here could be 20 degrees, something like that. So you could have, actually this one is going to be 20 and this would be 70 here, okay, for it to be most correct. So anyway, you could have different angle measures. So if the sides are all a different measure, the angles are all going to be a different measure also. All right, let's look at angles according to their triangles according to their angle measures. Equiangular and equilateral are very much alike. If a triangle is equilateral, it's equiangular. If a triangle is equiangular, it's equilateral also. So if all the angles are congruent, the triangle is called equiangular. Now, what's the measure? There's only one measure it can be. If all 3 of them are congruent, just take 180, divide by 3, and you get 60 degrees. So an equiangular triangle is always 60 degrees. All the angles are 60, and all the sides are congruent. All right, the next one is an acute triangle. An acute triangle, if you remember what an acute angle is, an acute angle is an angle between 0 degrees and 90 degrees. Okay, so all the angles in an acute triangle are going to be between 0 and 90 degrees. So if that's called acute. Okay, so every angle within the acute triangle will be between 0 and 90 degrees. The next one is going to be a right triangle. A right triangle is a triangle with one right angle. And remember, a right angle looks kind of like an L. And a lot of times we'll distinguish a right triangle with that little box right there. And you know that that is a 90-degree angle right there. So that's a right triangle. The last one is obtuse. An obtuse triangle is a triangle with only one obtuse angle. Now remember, an obtuse angle was between 90 and 180 degrees. So your obtuse triangle is going to be really wide. It's going to be open, 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 open. And this is going to be your obtuse angle. See how wide that is? That's going to be a measure between 90 and 180. And as a result, these little angles right there are going to be small. Because remember, all of this has to add up to 180. So you're using a lot of your 180 for that angle. So you don't have as much to use for these 2 angles. So they're going to be small compared to your obtuse angle there. All right, let's look at an example. This is a common type example that we'll look at in classifying the triangles. Let's finish up by looking at these 4 problems. All right, we want to classify the triangles by its sides and its angles. So if I have a triangle that's 45, 45, I've got to figure out what the third side is. So I can go 180 minus 45 minus 45, and that's going to get me 90 degrees. So my third angle is 90 degrees. Well, I can immediately think right here, if I've got 2 angles that are the same, I'm going to have 2 sides that are equal. If I have 2 sides that are equal, that's isosceles. And I've got a right angle, so according to my angles, that's a right triangle. Okay, let's go to number 2. I've got a 52-degree angle, a 61-degree angle. What's my third one? So go 180 minus 52 minus 61, and I get 67 degrees. So that third one is 67. So I've got 3 different angles. None of them are congruent. If I've got 3 different angles, that means I'm going to have 3 different sides. It's scattered. It's all different. So that's going to be scaling. According to its side, it's scaling. Okay, angles. What kind of angles do I see here? I don't see a right angle. I don't see an obtuse angle. They're all less than 90 degrees, so that is acute. So this triangle would be scaling and acute. Let's look at number 3. I've got 33 and 30, so I'm going to take 180 minus 33 minus 30, and that gets me 117. So my third angle is 117 degrees. What can I say about the sides? I've got 3 different angle lengths. They're all different. They're scattered. So it is going to be a scaling according to its sides. And what about the angles? I don't see a right angle. These 2 are acute, but look at this big one right here. That's 117 degrees. That's between 90 and 180. So that is an obtuse triangle right there. One more. If I've got 60, 60, what's that third angle? 60, right? 60 degrees. That all adds up to 180. So all the angles and all the sides are congruent. So this is equilateral and equiangular. There we go. That is classifying triangles. That's our lesson for today. I'm Mrs. Neill. Thank you for listening.